Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being patient and coming through the vaunted security system of this building. We know that people will trickle in, and we also know that the people downstairs who maybe made you go through a few hoops and whatever are trying to keep us safe. And this is the largest international federal building in Washington, I think even bigger than the Pentagon in Virginia, did you know? And it is an obvious target. So apropos of today's topic, we do thank them downstairs. Cybersecurity, the topic for today, is in the Wilson Center sweet spot. We are the only think tank, we think the only think tank surely in this town, with a science and technology innovation program. Acronym is STIP. Everybody needs an acronym. And STIP is 15 years old. Did you know? We want to welcome a lot of important people. Is that you, the Swiss ambassador? I can't see. Yes, it is. He comes to all of our programs these days. And we love Martin DeHinden. Thank you for being here. And others who support us. And then we want to continue, or I want to continue to brag a little bit more. We're also the only think tank to have the indomitable Meg King, whom I affectionately call Jane's brain. That is literally true. And today's event is another outstanding effort by Meg, the director of STIP, and the strategic counselor to me, and her team. In addition to the work we do in-house here, and I've just told you what that is, we have some close-in outside support working on the cyber issue, including on today's panel. Indeed, today's panel discussion was the idea of one panelist. To my immediate left, the co-chair of the Wilson Center Global Advisory Council, who moonlights as a senior figure at KKR in New York, General David Petraeus. Speaking of which, let me make a few more comments about today's panelists. Dave Petraeus has been my, and I think our go-to general for ground truth for decades. He led the combined forces in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, commanded the U.S. Central Command before becoming the director of CIA, all amazingly important jobs. And I was then in Congress for most of those jobs and usually took his advice. One time I didn't and got my head blown off, but he, in hindsight, was probably right. We don't have to refight that issue. Throughout his long and distinguished career, including 22 deployments, his selfless service to our country included taking what was essentially a demotion from CENTCOM to Commander Vicef in Afghanistan at a time of urgency for our country. Dave and I remain partners and dearest friends. And thank you for suggesting this. Thank you for your help to the Wilson Center, and thank you for being here. Suzanne Spalding was the executive director, she had lots of other big jobs, but the executive director of the National Commission on Terrorism, to which I was appointed in 1999. And our brilliant recommendation was one of three out there that said there would be, or could be, a catastrophic attack on the U.S. homeland. We delivered our report in 2000, and the catastrophic attack on the U.S. homeland came in 2001. I learned a lot in that effort, and she went on to become the chief of staff to the minority on the House Intelligence Committee. I was then the ranking member, and then to have several big jobs in the Homeland Security Department. She was the Undersecretary for National Programs and Protection Directorate, NPPD, at the Department of Homeland Security, and we'll go into renaming and other issues in a moment. She knows everything about Homeland Security. And finally, for mop-up, is a geophysicist named Evan Wolf, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. I guess we always glow about our global fellows. He was a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection at DHS, and his present job is as a lawyer running the cybersecurity practice at Crowell & Moring, and a few other things which he will talk about. And he can show us or discuss with us the legal landscape, including what holes exist. Evan also has concrete ideas about the good, the bad, and the ugly about the public-private partnership on cyber. Last but not least was supposed to be our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Kathleen Rice. Now, what just happened is that Congress called votes. You would all understand this, but the votes that were called are really crucial votes. I mean, some members make all votes, but these are serious votes on the issue of gun violence, and they have to do with background checks. And there's a series of them, so we couldn't find the right 10 minutes for Kathleen to get down here, and we couldn't work out the technology, don't laugh, for her to be Skyped in here. So guess who is going to, that would be me, summarize her written remarks, which we just got, and tell you a little bit more about her. She was the perfect choice for this because she is the chair of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Border Security Facilitation and Operations, but also a member of the Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation Subcommittee. And she also serves on the Veterans Affairs Committee. She's a former prosecutor who has focused extensively on cyber issues. And her bill to combat terrorist use of virtual currencies, which is a big issue in the terrorist world, maybe we'll discuss it, passed the House in 2019, pending in the Senate, and she has a second bill to require cybersecurity training for House members. That would be a good idea. Of course, the Wilson Center is already providing cybersecurity training for Hill staff, and for those of you who don't know, we have cyber boot camps that meet for semesters on consecutive Fridays that train Hill staff in cyber and also separate set of trainings in artificial intelligence. And over 350 staffers, bipartisan, bicameral, have gone through this training, including Kathleen Rice's legislative director, who has got to be the smartest person on her staff because that person was here. And our next semester starts tomorrow. Meg King directs all of this, too, and we get enormous plaudits for trying to increase the knowledge base on the Hill, and we hope that that knowledge base, very informed staff, will trickle up to members, and also the bipartisan friendships that they make might create some increasing bipartisan efforts on the Hill. My deathless soundbite has always been, the terrorists won't check our party registration before they blow us up. So let's kind of remember that as we go along. Okay, Kathleen, had she been here, would have said how wonderful the Wilson Center is, yes. She then would have told us that she spent 20 years working as a federal and local prosecutor, which is good background for this. And then she would say, I'm just reading some excerpts, as our national security paradigm has shifted increasingly toward cyberspace, the Homeland Security Committee, this is the House Committee, has worked hard to ensure that law enforcement agencies and DHS have the resources and capabilities not just to counter emerging cyber threats, but to stay one step ahead. But in order for us to be effective, I love this part, cybersecurity needs to be a bipartisan priority, regardless of the political rhetoric that often surrounds it. Cyber threats are rapidly evolving. Cyber criminals and state-sponsored cyber attackers are getting more and more sophisticated, and our government has too often been slow to respond. That needs to change. That is a bipartisan rant. I think it's fair to say our governments over 3 administrations in many ways have got some of it right and got some of it wrong. She then focuses on election infrastructure and on countering foreign influence efforts. She says that it's critical to remember that this isn't just a domestic issue. How we respond to this threat has major implications for our foreign policy agenda, particularly as it relates to our close allies in Western Europe. Countries like France, England, and Germany are all dealing with the exact same threat. And the last thing they want or expect to see is that we aren't taking the threat seriously enough. She goes on to talk about the committee and what it has been trying to do. And one of the things she highlights is that last year it established the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Sisse. And Suzanne is, the cheerleader in chief is, and I think a huge part of that victory goes to Suzanne. Kudos for Suzanne. And she says, in this Congress, we're going to remain committed to giving Sisse the authorities and funding it needs. And she says, then another issue is going to be who's the point person in the administration. And she says she's heard from a lot of stakeholders who don't know who in the federal government that they should ask for help or who is in charge. DHS, the Election Assistance Commission, called EAC, or the FBI, that's confusing, and that's one of their next tasks. And then she says that she and some others have called on the president because of this problem to appoint an election security coordinator within the White House. So note that, folks, and let's hear what you think about it. So Congress needs to help the administration lead the fight. That's her first point. So it's election security. Second point is we have to protect the energy grid. She says we need strong cyber procurement standards to prevent foreign states from entrenching themselves in our other critical infrastructure like transportation, telecommunications, and financial systems. Third point, we need to look at how terrorist organizations and malign foreign actors and criminals might use cyberspace to exploit our businesses. Good point. And she talks about some of the problems in connection with that. And then fourth point, she talks about virtual currencies. And as I mentioned, her bill on that, the abuse of virtual currencies by terrorist organizations, has passed the House. That's a pretty big deal to get that done. And now it is pending in the Senate, and let's hope action is taken there. Conclusion. Our nation is blessed with some of the sharpest minds in law enforcement, national security, and cyberspace, some of whom are sitting to my left. We will work together, Democrats and Republicans, to harness that talent and come up with workable solutions to combat this threat, both here at home and with our allies abroad. And yes, we will. So with that by way of intro, let me turn to our panel now. And say good morning. Good morning. I know Kathleen would have done it better, but I tried. And I think what we'll do is just give you each a chance for a few minutes to comment on some of her points, but also on your take on this issue. And the good news is these folks have some differences of opinion, which is what we always try to display at the Wilson Center so we can have a conversation. And I think we will start with Dave Petraeus. So if you can take, we've got more time than we thought, if you can take 5 to 8 minutes summarizing some thoughts. We'll go to Suzanne, then we'll go to Evan, and then I have questions for each of you. And then, guess what, everybody? You get to ask your questions. Okay.
Well, thanks, Jane. Thanks for pulling this together. Thanks to Meg King for helping to bring this off. Thanks to all of you for being here. And thanks to my fellow panelists with whom it's a privilege to be on this stage. I am indeed the one who sort of pushed for this, and that was based on a conviction for some years that the U.S. government is not sufficiently organized for the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. And I've written about this, went public with this last year, and again, then started pushing the Wilson Center to do something on this. And then all of a sudden along came the DHS Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Agency creation, which is not the fully independent National Cybersecurity Agency for which I called in what I've written, but I do think is a very important step forward. And in fact, it could be what is necessary. And I think time will tell. This is one of those cases where you look forward to confirming the excellence of a new entity, which is, of course, something that's grown out of, a previous entity that Suzanne oversaw when she was the undersecretary at DHS. And we will have to, again, see how this pulls everything together and performs the tasks on which I think focus is necessary. I might add, just as an aside, in addition to being a partner at KKR, I'm also on the board of Optiv, which is the largest pure-play cybersecurity services firm in the world. We own it. And I've also spent time visiting the UK National Cybersecurity Center, which I think may be the best of the national ones that have been established. It's created in a way that is quite impressive by taking the GCHQ, their version of NSA, and building around that, something that's probably not legally possible for us to build around, say, NSA, which I would contend is the biggest repository of true both defensive and cybersecurity and intelligence expertise in the U.S. government, noting that the CIA also has a very capable entity as well. I've looked at what Israel has, what Singapore has, and some others. And I very strongly support the points that were made by the Congresswoman, and I'm glad that you could summarize those, Jane. I think that there are 5 tasks on which the new Sisse needs to focus, and these would be the tasks by which we would measure how it is doing. First of all, it has to do with authorities. Can this agency now speak for the entire executive branch to Congress and work with legislators to gain legislation, funding, other authorities and resources that it needs to effectively oversee the cybersecurity of our infrastructure? I think that it will find a receptive audience among Washington policymakers and those on Capitol Hill. I've talked to a number of them. A number asked me to come by after I published the piece last year. All of them agree that more needs to be done to shore up cyber defenses. And now with this agency, again, at the level essentially of TSA, Secret Service, Coast Guard, CBP, et cetera, at that level underneath DHS, perhaps this can be done. As an aside, I do think it would help if 2 positions were restored at the White House. One is the cybersecurity czar, if you will, the Rob Joyce position, and the other is the Homeland Security National Security Advisor or deputy, both of which have been done away with over the course of the last year or so. The second task has to do with oversight. Can the new Sisse actually oversee the departments that are assigned responsibility for critical infrastructure cybersecurity, and this does include physical aspects of this as well. Keeping in mind that this is an area where there's a great deal of unevenness in government. You have what would arguably be the gold standard, which is the Treasury's oversight of the financial institutions, that critical infrastructure category, done very, very well. And then it becomes less impressive as you work through the others. And some of these, of course, are very, very important areas. If you think of the cyber equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction, you can find that in some of the categories of cybersecurity. One would be, of course, a failure to protect the electrical grid sufficiently so that it could be taken down and then actually kept down. It's the duration of keeping a portion of the grid down that could cause that eventual accumulation of challenges that could really be similar to the effect of a weapon of mass destruction. So can this new agency provide the oversight for the different departments that are assigned the responsibility, again, Treasury Department for banks, FERC for utilities, and so forth, not doing it itself, but certainly overseeing it, and where it's applicable, and it's not applicable in many cases because, as Evan pointed out earlier upstairs, the differences of these different categories of critical infrastructure are almost greater than the areas of commonality. But undoubtedly, there will be some lessons learned and best practices that could be applied with adjustment for the specifics of different areas. Another area, I think, on which this new agency will be judged, should be judged, is its ability to share information, especially when it comes to threats. This is an area that I think right now most would acknowledge is not being done in the way that we would like to see it done. It's certainly not the single clearinghouse needed by government and industry, coordinating real-time updates on attacks, threats, and vulnerabilities. There are various estimates of how many firms in different categories even participate in threat sharing. And it is very likely an area that will need to be shored up by legislation, because especially if you are going to force some of these different companies and firms to share information, there will have to be some protections for them should there be financial consequences for that. And that's an area that I think will be very challenging, but one that we have to come to grips with. And again, the foundation for this will be from legislation. Another huge challenge that the Sisse will be measured against will be that of attracting the quantity and the quality of people needed for this new organization. Harvard's Belfer Center estimates that the overall federal government alone has a deficit of 10,000 cybersecurity professionals. Can this new Sisse attract the kind of talent that is necessary and in the amount that is also necessary, in the way that arguably I think NSA and the entity within the CIA that works on cyber issues have proven that they can. This is a big question because again, if you it is about people and sufficient number of high quality people. And whether this is possible, I think, remains to be seen. It's going to require branding. It's going to have the same kind of cachet and attractiveness that NSA has been able to establish over the years, noting that, of course, NSA cannot get into this area for a variety of legal reasons. It is an externally facing foreign intelligence entity. And as we were trying to have it edge into this space, of course, the Snowden revelations made it a degree radioactive in what some of us thought it might be able to do over time. So I think these are the questions that are out there now as Sisse, which is still, I guess, just about 6 months old. It was established mid-November last year. A little bit less than 6 months then. Can it actually perform these tasks against which, again, it will be measured, I think rightly, in performing a critically important mission? And again, to come back to where we started with the Congresswoman's comments, legislation is going to be critical. And generally, in this space, and I watched this as the director of the CIA when the Rogers-Ruppersberger bill we thought was a no-brainer, a least common denominator effort, and ultimately took years to get through rather than what should have been a very quick process. Can this entity establish the relationship with Congress in a bipartisan manner to get the legislative foundations that will be necessary on which to build, again, the policies, the regulations, and the organizational architecture necessary to ensure cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure? Thanks.
Thank you. Suzanne.
All right. So I have not been an advocate for creating a separate cabinet-level department for cybersecurity. I have been, as you heard, a very strong advocate for the creation of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS out of what had been the National Protection and Programs Directorate. Starting with National Protection Programs Directorate is a horrible name. Told you nothing about what we did at DHS. And so people who thought, I just found out that DHS has some cybersecurity mission, and they go online, they cannot find the cybersecurity, entity within DHS unless they go deep into the bowels of the organization. So this was really an important, as insignificant as it may at first seem, branding effort, and it gets to the issue of recruiting and retaining talent. Although I will say that we actually did pretty well in retaining talent that we had recruited. Our retention rates were really not abnormal across the government. But certainly in terms of letting folks know that there is this exciting cybersecurity mission at DHS, having a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency makes a big difference. It also makes a big difference in terms of the workforce itself and understanding its mission. And I'm going to come back to that because it has to do with combining the physical and cyber and understanding that as one mission to protect critical infrastructure. I agree wholeheartedly with General Petraeus that the loss of the cybersecurity coordinator at the White House and the Homeland Security advisor at the White House is hugely problematic and really makes this task much, much more difficult. We know we need better coordination across the federal government with regard to cybersecurity. I think there are real limits on the ability of one department or agency to provide oversight, to direct, even really to effectively coordinate other departments and agencies' activities without strong daily engagement and pushing and help from the White House. And I don't know where John Bolton would find the time to do that. But he's built, then you're down into the senior director level. So I think that's really problematic and really would be a much more effective fix than, again, pulling this out and creating a separate standalone agency. That said, Sisse at DHS does have some pretty significant authority over other departments and agencies. And it succeeds in this because it has the backing of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which has the purse strings at the end of the day and the ability to approve or not approve other departments and agencies' budgets, frankly. So they have binding operational directive authority, which people learned about when they put out the directive on Kaspersky, not purchasing Kaspersky products. That was something that one department, DHS, issued that was binding on all other departments and agencies, which is pretty remarkable authority. So they have that, and they've been using it increasingly, and I think increasingly effectively. The responsibility for overseeing critical infrastructure writ large and providing guidance to all departments and agencies and receiving input on how they're doing was long ago given to the Secretary of Homeland Security. So I think, again, with White House backing, using that authority more robustly would go a long way. At the end of the day, I think the most significant reason that I would not support creating a separate cybersecurity department beyond the disruption and the amount of time and effort that it would take to get over that disruption and get back into a good operational rhythm, meanwhile our adversary is racing straight ahead, is that we do need to have really an all-hazards approach to thinking about disruption of critical infrastructure. And I was so pleased that Congress created Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I don't love those exact words, but that they resisted calls that were out there to pull the cyber piece away from the physical security and resilience piece. Cybersecurity is all about risk management. Risk management is about understanding threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, and then mitigating against all three. Understanding consequences has been underappreciated. Cybersecurity has focused heavily on threats and vulnerabilities, and those are massive and huge and will never have 100% fix for the threats and the vulnerabilities that create such significant cyber risk for us. Understanding consequences becomes, I think, one of the most important ways to prioritize your allocation of resources. Right? You want to prioritize your resources on those things that could have the greatest impact on your mission, if you're a government agency, on your mission-critical functions, or on your business, if you're a private sector entity. And to understand that, your IT folks cannot tell you the impact on your business, any more than the electrician can tell you the impact on your business if you're out of power for a week. Those are your business people who understand your operations. They understand what your industrial control systems operate. What are the functions they enable? They're the people who understand what are the most important activities of your agency or business on a daily basis. And DHS and Sisse are moving toward a focus on functions, functionality. It's at the end of the day, we are about making sure that Americans can rely on, dependably, the goods and services that are fundamental to our way of life. So we have to worry about the electric grid, availability of electricity, whether it's disrupted from cyber or any other cause. And we have to understand the consequences if that goes down. So that's a critical way in which the operational and the physical needs to be joined at the hip with the folks who understand IT networks. It's also essential for mitigation, which I think is increasingly one of the most important ways we're going to address this. And you hear about it in terms of resilience, right? So there's a lot of effort on protecting and defending our networks, but increasing understanding that we are never going to be able to protect them entirely, and we better have strong resilience so that when that malicious activity happens, when that incident takes place, we can respond and recover effectively and get back up quickly. And that requires also having that non-IT expertise. The best mitigation against a significant cyber attack might be put in a hand crank. It might be having paper ballots, right? And so having that combined, and how you do that in a separate cyber agency tends to become technically focused. So I'll leave it at that.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Evan, and please talk about what a wonderful time you're having at the Wilson Center.
Yeah, well, let me start off by thanking you, Jane, and Meg for allowing me to continue to be a part of the Wilson Center. It's been an honor and a privilege and a lot of fun helping evolve cybersecurity and the thoughts here. And so, and also let me start off by also saying, since General Petraeus is a long-term hero of mine and Suzanne is a long-term friend of mine, I agree with you both 100%. I even agree with your disagreements with each other, so I'll let that stand, and I'll talk about something completely different, as the youngest child does always on things like this. Because, since leaving DHS, I've spent the last 11 years helping companies deal with incidents. I've been involved in hundreds of cybersecurity incidents, some of the largest data breaches.
Caused them or helped to mitigate?
It led the investigation as outside counsel, led the technical forensic investigation, and help companies, when necessary, disclose them to third parties, including government agencies and the public. Majority, I would say, of which the investigations I've worked on have not been disclosed because, it's part of what you have to do during investigations, determine if there's a third party disclosure obligation. So, but I want to talk about sort of two trends that I think really fit in between what General Petraeus and Suzanne were talking about, which is where the private sector fits into this model, because they are ultimately, the DHS has two big missions when it comes to protecting civilian critical cybersecurity infrastructure, but they also have to work with the private sector. And when we look to General Petraeus' idea of what the evolution of that looks like, if there is one, they're going to still have to deal with the private sector piece. And so there's two challenges that we see in the private sector that I'm going to sort of group together. The first is scale, and the second is convergence. And I want to talk about the problem of scale, because especially when we look at other countries, whether it be the UK or Israel or Singapore, we have a scale issue here that is sort of uncomparable when it comes to the private sector to other countries. We have the amount of incidents that occur and the investigations that are then pursuing, and the ability to work with law enforcement on all those right now in the current model is just not it's not sustainable, it's not approachable even, because companies, if you look at a big incident that often will impact hundreds of their supply chain, there's just not the manpower within government right now to do that. Not that we couldn't create a scalable approach, but that's just not where we're at right now. And we really need to understand what scaling an investigation for even a sector or multiple sectors. If we look at the financial services sector, where they've developed a very simple approach to how they regulate their infrastructure and how banks and other financial institutions are required to protect their infrastructure. that is a scalable solution. And what we've been seeing over the last, since 2013 to 2016, the Department of Defense has decided they are going to create a regulatory approach to managing their cybersecurity infrastructure through putting a new clause in the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. To those of you that like speaking DoD acronyms, it's called the 7012 clause. And what that really requires is all defense contractors to not only protect their infrastructure and the information that DoD gives them, but also requires them to flow that down to all their subs. So it's estimated that there are now 100,000 contracts that have this one clause in it. So that means there are 100,000 companies that are required to do more now than they were, even a few months or a few years ago. And so that is another example of a scalable solution. But ultimately, when we think about incident response, there has to be someone working with companies, just as I've often thought about. I work with a lot of energy companies and a lot of infrastructure companies. Not a single one of them has a Scud missile defense program, even though a Scud missile would devastate their infrastructure. But yet they are asked to prepare and protect themselves against some of the sort of nation states, advanced persistent threats, and some of our enemy combatant nation states in a way that they don't have to do physically. And we really have to come up with, as a nation, a scalable approach, one that deals with both the threat, but also how we do with the response. And we do this in other areas of crime. If we think about how we work with criminal investigations at a local level with the FBI and local law enforcement for robberies and other areas. So there's ideas out there that work. I think we need to, one idea that's often been talked about is a national cyber Transportation Safety Board, or an NTSB for cyber, where we can decide when we have really big events, we have a way of doing those investigations. But second, I want to talk about convergence, because we really are at a very unique time right now, and I'm going to talk about three quick areas. The first, where we are with technology, then with policy and regulations, and finally within governance. Because within technology, we have a very sort of, it's a fun time to be doing cyber and working in the privacy field, because just the very nature of industry networks are changing. They are going from what used to be on-prem and stored on-premises and sort of locally managed networks to things that are almost entirely on the cloud, and companies very seldom actually buy their own software, just buying software as a service. And while some think there's some negatives associated with it, it's a really good thing for most companies, because it allows you to have better security, better availability, but it also makes running investigations and working with government can be much more difficult. And that's something, as we think about this sort of point of where we're going between industry and government, we need to think about this convergence. And we also need to take a lesson learned from what we learned during the 40s and 50s with the advent of really complex technology like seatbelts, safety glass, and bumpers in cars. Because right now, you don't need to have any basic security before you buy a computer and hook it up to the internet. And just like I'm very glad I get to put a seatbelt on my 13-year-old every morning, I really wish we would have similar measures in place before we allow, especially consumer, but also for industrial users of the internet and connected devices. Just quickly on regulations, I think there is a convergence here occurring as well, because we're seeing multiple sectors. If you look at the defense or the government contracting community, or even the energy community, where they are both having to think about themselves as an internet service provider, as an energy provider, and oftentimes as dealing with people's, their customers' privacy and sensitive data, and also some of them are global providers, so they have to worry about global regulations. We really need to not regulate our way to death with where we're going right now, and I think taking each sector, even though I agree that the greatest similarity with our critical infrastructures are there differences, we also have to understand where they have common infrastructure, and we can think about what are the common threats and the common risks they approach. And this is where I wholeheartedly agree with General Petraeus' point about understanding what is the law enforcement's role and what is the intelligence community's role versus law enforcement's role versus what industry can do for themselves. And finally, there's really a convergence within companies on who's in charge. As I learned in my first few days, weeks, and months and years at DHS, that if you have to have someone in charge of each project and each mission, and especially when we were trying to build out the Department of Homeland Security, there's a shift within industry where we have a new position that's being created in almost every company, the Chief Information Security Officer. and some of their importance is being taken away from someone that used to exist within the company called the Chief Information Officer, and how that convergence and that switching of power between the CIO and CISO, while that can seem like a sort of silly boardroom dispute or discussion within companies, really has very significant implications for companies. And ultimately, industry is dealing with the same talent issue that government is dealing with. And so we have some great examples of where industry and government were able to come together and have real jointness. I often think about the Defense Production Act, and without sounding like a legal geek for a second, Section 702 of the Defense Production Act was, I think, one of the more important points of our national defense history, because it allowed industry and government to come and work together and do things like build planes and do things in ways that we can't do right now in terms of dealing with a national security threat, because we have legitimate regulations like antitrust and anti-trade laws that stand in the place of some of the interactions we'd really like to have. So I do think we have this opportunity with this great convergence to think about things a little differently. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jane.
Well, thank you, Evan, and thank you all. We missed Kathleen Rice, but I got to say, we got so much from this panel and from the diverse experience reflected on this panel. And I hope they got a lot from each other, and we're going to probe a little of that. I can't resist, though, first telling an acronym story. I mean, everybody else is sharing this stuff. So here's mine. So after two catastrophic intelligence failures, one on 9/11 and the next one on Iraq WMD, Congress did go into action and on a bipartisan basis pass the Intelligence Reform Law. It has an acronym, but I'm not talking about that one, in 2004. And one of the conversations at the end of the negotiation by the so-called Big Four, the Big Four were in the House, Pete Huckstra, who chaired the House Intelligence Committee, me as the ranking Democrat, and in the Senate, the Homeland Committee was the partner. Susan Collins was the chair of the committee, and Joe Lieberman was the ranking member in the Senate at the time. So we were the Big Four. The big conversation was, what do we call this person who is the joint command across 16 intelligence agencies? And the going idea was National Intelligence Director. Makes sense, right? What's the acronym for National Intelligence Director? NID. And I said, no, sounds like a bug. We can't do it. And then we changed it to the Director of National Intelligence. So I bet you guys didn't know that that's what happened. DNI is not susceptible to a shortened form, and I think at least it's not a bug. So my first question is about urgency. I mean, this is interesting. Everybody agrees we need to restore White House coordination. Some agree, some don't, that we need a separate agency. But I remember in my role on the National Commission on Terrorism, having lunch with the then chairman, whose name is L. Paul Bremer, Jerry Bremer, who later became our leader in Iraq. We had a conversation on 9/10/2001. And we were talking about, why is no one paying attention to our recommendations? Don't they understand that a catastrophic attack on the U.S. homeland is imminent? Well, next day, guess what? So my question is, will it take another or some form of a serious or catastrophic attack on the U.S. homeland to get to a point where we reestablish a homeland commander in the White House or a separate agency to direct focus?
Well, let me start, if I could, just to clarify one point. I'm not pushing for an independent agency at this point. I actually think that we should allow the Sisse establishment to go forward, and it should be, in a sense, graded in these issues that I talked about: authority, oversight, information sharing. Also, investment would be another, and then the whole issue of talent. And so let's see how that goes. There are advantages if DHS as a headquarters can be value added to the agency that is under it in this case. If it cannot, then obviously I would return to calling for a separate agency. So I think it's not an issue of an attack being a catalyst for a separate agency. It's really, will it require attack to get the legislation, to get the regulation, to get the policy, to get the resources, to get the talent, and all the rest of this quickly? Or is this going to drag out the way some legislation has in the past, to the point that we're, in a sense, legislative, often shooting behind the target? And the same is arguably true for some of the policy and regulatory issues. This is, advances in cyberspace are so rapid that they're literally outstripping our ability to keep up with them intellectually, much
No
less
question.
in terms of actually having legislation, which even when there is a catalyst can still take some time. So I think that's really the question that we have here, and I hope it doesn't take the cyber equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction to give a huge impetus to this. I hope that individuals like the Congresswoman and others can drive this themselves on Capitol Hill. Again, I think all three of us believe, all four of us believe, that it would be better if you had someone at the White House who has the authority of the president as a Homeland Security advisor underneath the president, and as the cybersecurity czar, if you will, for the president. I think that would help, but let's also see what Sisse can do. Can the director of this agency establish the relationship with those on Capitol Hill where they can move forward rapidly? Can there be bipartisanship on these issues? Will the House in Democratic control and a Senate and Republican control enable this, perhaps? I think those are the questions that we really have to address.
I don't disagree, but just focusing on the White House for a second, this White House downgraded 2 positions. That's what part of what we're talking about. They could upgrade those 2 positions or fill them but they could upgrade them. Tom Bossert, who held one of them, has spoken here several times and is well known to some of us, and my view was highly qualified in that role. And there is no Tom Bossert now at the White House. I think it's fair to say that. So do you think, well, let's just move to Suzanne, do you think there's urgency in upgrading the White House role? I'm sure you agree with what General Petraeus just said about Sisse and its potential, since you are the grandmother of Sisse. But do you think we also need the White House coordinator role to make Sisse succeed in full and to make our government be prepared?
I do, and that is the only amendment I would make, or the way I would articulate what General Petraeus has said with respect to Sisse's creation and its impact on ideas about a Department of Cybersecurity, which is, what I would ask is, what do we need to do to make sure that Sisse succeeds? So I get a lot of, well, I don't know if they're going to be able to do it, and my response is, look, that the train has left the station. This is what Congress has decided. This is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and what we all need to be doing now is figuring out how do we make sure that this agency succeeds in its mission and is able to do what we need it to do. And I think, Jane, that feeds right into your sense of urgency and do we need some kind of an attack? We all know that
I'm not recommending an attack.
No.
Let me put that out there.
But will it take that to get the sense of urgency? And we all know that there are significant cyber attacks every single day. And we've had some fairly spectacular ones over the last, couple of years, particularly. But I do think that it hasn't penetrated into the American public, so it doesn't have the political saliency yet. They have some vague sense of worry. They know they should be vaguely worried, but they haven't. They're not scared. And I'm not a big proponent of using fear to drive constructive decision making. But I think the biggest thing is less even a sense of urgency than a sense of that we have to be serious about resourcing this. Mm-hmm. We have the 2019 budget is, I think, just under $15 billion for cybersecurity across the government. DHS has $1 billion budget, if I think I've got those numbers right, for cybersecurity. I mean, we really do need a sense of urgency to take that seriously. I agree with Evan on the need for scale, and I think local law enforcement is an interesting place to look to for that. FBI doesn't respond to every single robbery. They can't be expected, nor can DHS, to every single cyber incident. And I do think that the seatbelt idea, is a compelling one, but extremely challenging in the cybersecurity arena, because we've talked about the incredible pace of change. And so whatever is this, we don't even know, I don't know what the seatbelt would be today, and we certainly don't know how long it will be before that's outdated. And so I think regulation is incredibly hard in this arena, which is why I think the private sector role is so important. I'm a big believer in trying to rely on markets and count on markets to be more efficient, which is not to say there isn't a point at which we need regulation. But there's a lot more that we can do and that the private sector can help us do. Moody's report today that talks about how we need to consider cybersecurity when we evaluate the credit worthiness of an entity is exactly the kind of market pressure that we need. We need tech analysts to have a column. When you're trying to buy that latest gee whiz technology, Internet of Things device for your home, for example, and you go online to compare, in addition to telling you how fast it is and all the wonderful features and capabilities, there should be a column for how secure it is. How well does it protect your privacy? Megan Stifel at Public Knowledge has written a good paper about an Energy Star equivalent to help consumers be more informed consumers. And then the technology world is in fact becoming more and more robust in terms of providing cybersecurity technologies that can help us. And I'm on the board of 3 different companies, a threat collaboration company platform called Avalon, an OT area where industrial control systems and operational technology, we're seeing companies stand up. I'm on the board of Nozomi Networks, Dragos. There are other companies out there that are stepping up to help with the security for industrial control systems. And then last on the market is market incentives is insurance. And we're seeing a more and more robust every day demand for and thoughtful approaches to providing cybersecurity insurance.
Dave had an intervention. I'm getting to you, Evan. I have a tough question for you, Evan.
Well, I think the advent of the Internet of Things is just an explosion, really. If I put my old CIA hat on, where we were in the breaking and entering business, that it just an incredible number of attack surfaces, as the term is used. And they generally come with minimal cybersecurity built into them, if any at all. Some are rushed to market, and many people don't change the password that it comes with, again, or pay no attention, again, to actually securing these various devices, all of which eventually can actually connect to a central node that means that this is another way into a system. And for what it's worth, I'm also an investor in Indigi, which is an Israeli, now American industrial control system firm, startup that's really expanding very rapidly. I mean, this is another whole area, the whole ICS arena, where you have technology that is in some cases 2 decades old, hasn't really been updated, and yet this is literally what is controlling the critical infrastructure in certain of these different sectors. And so that's another area of enormous focus that has to accelerate, given the acceleration of ways to get into various devices and systems.
So, Evan, one idea that you've put out there that we haven't discussed yet is requiring stress tests for cyber, just like we have for banks. Tell us about that. And would that add to protection, even for those of us who don't understand how much protection we really need?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess just picking up on Suzanne and General Petraeus' point, I'm not saying just because mostly I'd be fired by every company I ever represented that we can regulate our way out of this problem. I don't think this is a regulatory issue in and of itself. I don't think it's also a public sector problem that we can just build the perfect federal agency that can sort of oversee and supervise and that will solve all our security problems. It really has to be sort of a collaborative, or as I sometimes like to call it, a collective defense and response activity. And when we think about where we have good examples of collective activities between government and industry, it's when we have great crises. And I don't think we, I spend very little time thinking about what the cyber 9/11 is going to look like. So I think we need to think about what the cyber response is going to look like. And this is I guess,
How about what the cyber prevention to 9/11 is going to look like?
And what we didn't have the opportunity to do when we stood up DHS and as the parent of the department, there was a lot of really great work done, but it was done very quickly. And what we have the opportunity to do now is be thoughtful about what we are going to need from the ability of government and industry to work together. So one of the ideas that I think is useful to talk about is, we've learned from the response to TARP and the financial crisis that we need industry banks specifically to be able to see test themselves on what the worst possible day looks like, and what does it mean when they are stressed beyond their sort of current regulatory environment or their current sort of norms, and then understand and learn from that. What we've learned from both military and government actions is that sort of the idea of doing simulations exercises or tabletop exercises is one of the best ways of learning to prepare for something, because you learn you learn to fight by preparing to fight, and that's something that really, if we were to require and or allow banks to do this, maybe as a way of generating lower insurance fees, maybe as a way of getting better authority to have better access to infrastructure. But the idea of having banks having sort of critical infrastructure and doing it on a scaled way that makes sense to them, to have that kind of stress test, I think could work. But we also need to think more broadly to sort of the real problem we have right now of, as I call it, the sort of the crack top problem, that we have these $200 and $300 laptops that you can buy, put on the internet, and that become within minutes or sometimes seconds, part of the problem. They become botnets. They become sort of part of the threat environment. We also need to think about, as Suzanne said, we can't regulate our way because the tech industry is so based in the U.S. that if we create too many regulations, we're going to be preventing the sort of very inspiration that created the internet and created the tech industry. So
that leads to my last question, and get ready. You'll have about 15 minutes for your questions. My last question is about the international environment. I mean, we all know that Western Europe has also been subject to influence operations from Russia. Western Europe, through the EU and sometimes individually, has responded in various ways. The French were enormously clever in the last 24 hours of their election, blocking Russian influence because they go dark the last 24 hours, and the Russians didn't know that, and that, kudos to them. But do we need, in addition to what we've just discussed, a more internationalized response and or the ability to learn from best practices from others? And or do we risk the balkanization of responses so that it becomes enormously hard for there to be innovation in the internet and or the ability for the private sector to operate?
First of all, there is a lot of sharing in this space. If you think of, again, a combination of CIA and NSA with a variety of partners around the world, whether it's GCHQ or the equivalent of the Five Eyes, or with Unit 8200 and Mossad and Shin Bet in Israel as an example, there's a lot of sharing that goes on. It can always be better. And again, there are limits for foreign intelligence focused services when it comes to homeland security issues. And so the question here is, again, will this Sisse be able to step up and not just be the quarterback for overall homeland security when it comes to cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, but can it have that element as well? And so, you'd want to see the organizational architecture for this agency, see what the plugs are from NSA, CIA, from FBI, from other than state, and in some cases perhaps even local, when it comes to some of the very critical elements of our infrastructure. There is an issue that is not necessarily about the sharing here that I think is worth watching right now, and that is a degree of balkanization or even fracturing of the World Wide Web, which is really not worldwide anymore. There are portions of it that are protected by the Great Firewall of China. There are other portions where there are limiting features to that. You see the data protection that's been implemented by Europe now that, again, has implications. In some cases, the data has to stay there. By the way, some of this brought about by the Snowden revelations, which cost some of our major internet service providers and so forth enormous sums of money because of how they had to change, again, their storage practices and so forth. And then if you get into issues of concerns about supply chain origin and the concerns right now that are out there about, say, for example, Huawei or ZTE or so forth, you could actually see, again, a fracturing of the supply chain as well. Although, again, none of this is clear. My hope would be that there can be sufficient reassurance so that we can indeed have a global supply chain, and it can indeed be one in which there's mutually beneficial relationships rather than zero-sum activities.
Thank you. Other comments on this?
Yeah, no, General, your example of Huawei and the need for an stronger international consensus around that is exactly right, and I think one of the best examples, Jane, of why we do need to make sure that we look at this as an international, not just U.S. problem. There's no U.S. only solution to the supply chain problem. There is fairly robust, certainly there was as of 2 years ago when I left, and I would assume it's only gotten stronger, CERT-to-CERT relationships all over the world. And the CERT is the Computer Emergency Response or Computer Emergency Readiness teams that are there to take in cyber threat information, but really to help in preparing for and conducting response activities as well. And that information sharing and technology sharing and understanding and coordination on response is very robust. So at that working level, I'm pretty confident about that. I did want to pick up on your mention of information operations, because that's the project that I'm leading at the Center for Strategic International Studies, is defending democratic institutions. And it begins with the understanding that Russia's information operations go way beyond elections. Or in our public discourse, we've focused so heavily on, the elections, and now we got through the midterms, and now we're okay till 2020. And what we need to really broaden the understanding of is that no, they are acting every single day to undermine public trust and confidence in democracy and our democratic institutions. I'm focusing particularly on attacks on public confidence in the justice system, and where we are so behind Western Europe. And you talked about, some of the effective steps that they've taken. Really, the fundamental difference is their governments take this seriously and are leading this in a whole-of-nation response in a very robust way. They are raising public awareness within their populations about this threat and how serious it is. And they are working on building public resilience, which is something that we're looking at very carefully in our project. Civics education, helping the public understand the value of democracy and how it operates, and civic engagement, media literacy, building public resilience against those narratives, helping them understand what they are. Yep. And there's a real lesson from Western Europe.
Well, I didn't call them information attempts. I call them influence attempts, because I think that's what they are. I don't think that is real information that they're putting out. Evan, do you have another comment, or we're going to go to the audience?
Social media companies as well, in a way that is very instructive, I think. So we really should be watching the debate that they've had and what they're now doing as a result of those debates.
Hear, hear. Evan, do you have another comment, or should we go to the audience?
Well, I've just a quick comment maybe as we go to the audience, because under the sort of premise that all things global or local, as we understand that industry that operates a global one, oftentimes a single network or a highly segregated set of networks with information stored either sort of locally or in the cloud, they are often, as General Petraeus talked about, regulated under the new European data protection regulations, and in certain countries they have data localization regulations. But within the U.S., there still exists now 50 different state data breach laws. So they also have to understand what it means to operate a network in the U.S. And if we really want a company and we want industry that's providing these services to both the U.S. and the global economy, we need to understand what is a sustainable way and the best way to, in a risk-based measure, to create these barriers and to create the boundaries for them. And I understand and agree that there's been a lot of politics in terms of how we ended up here with the regulation, but I think it's really, we're not on a sustainable path, and I often call these sort of first generation regulations, and what we need to start thinking about is how can, and we've done this with global financial industry, think about what are better ways to regulate a global economy or a global infrastructure like the internet. So
questions. Identify yourself and ask a question. In the middle right here, in the blue shirt, we have a microphone.
Good morning. My name is Lucian Rambato. I'm a senior at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, and I'll be working in cryptological warfare upon graduation in May. So the panel discussed supply chain interdiction and the issues present with Huawei in China and the challenges present to all of the U.S. that uses technology there. But my question is, do you think contractors for the government should be held to an even higher standard and a higher level of scrutiny when they supply technologies that I'll be using next year when I do my job? Because that's the most critical of all the critical infrastructure is what the military uses. So I want to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
Thank you, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Answer, maybe General Petraeus?
Well, look, I think it's not just contractors, it's everyone who's involved in providing either hardware or software. And again, this becomes a real supply chain challenge. Can you actually validate? How do you verify? And ultimately, it may be that we should be learning from what the British are doing, where they have quite a considerable organizations set up to test, for example, Huawei. Now, I wish it wasn't funded by Huawei and largely staffed by people who used to work for Huawei. But they're, again, the combination of their National Cybersecurity Center and GCHQ and other entities have established this. And they believe that it gives them the confidence to use some of those products. Again, I think at the very least it's worth examining that and determining whether that would be sufficient for us, noting that, of course, there is legislation in China, law, that says that every company has to help the government when called upon, and that is a bit unsettling, given the efforts in cyberspace to steal huge quantities of information to help with counterintelligence. Think the OPM hack, think some of the other hacks that have provided enormous amount of personal information, and then also, of course, the theft of intellectual property that has gone on.
Evan?
Yeah, if I could just, because I think the defense and government contracting base do need to be held to a higher standard, but I would also argue they are right now under the procurement system that we've established. And here I'm going to sort of take steal a page from General Petraeus and Suzanne's discussion around Sisse, because here we need to give this new system time. We've only started truly regulating the defense regulation, the information that's used in DoD in 2016 is when sort of we began this modern regulatory environment. And so, in DoD speak, that is like, barely a couple minutes or a couple of days in terms of our procurement cycle. We haven't yet figured out how to do that, and we're expected to have a clause for the rest of the government contractors in the federal acquisition regulations for how everyone else buys infrastructure. But there does need to be a higher standard for government contractors. But I think we have one right now. Whether it's good or bad, I think time will tell, and everyone is watching it carefully. And we also think about, just to add in one other point, we also regulated our technology not only by sort of what are the security controls that defense companies need to do, but also by how they're allowed to export it. We have a very sort of long history of export regulations that, don't always work perfectly, but they work.
And CFIUS is being strengthened quite robustly. I think
Absolutely.
That's one of the results of concerns in recent
that's right.
years.
Question in the front row. Wait for the microphone. Here it comes.
Thank you. My name is Mark Turnage. I'm the CEO of a cybersecurity company. Last week I sat in on a panel that General Petraeus chaired at the Munich Security Forum conference on on how far behind the government is from the private sector. And I think the consensus in the room was that in certain technologies, artificial intelligence being the one most notably, the government lags the private sector and in many cases lags the bad guys by 5 to 10 years. In my experience, that's very clearly the case. And what I want to ask you about is why is that the case? And in my view, it's because the procurement process is fundamentally broken. This new organization, Sisse, is not going to be effective unless it has legislative authority to streamline the procurement process. I would say 3/4 of my peers in the cybersecurity industry don't do business with the federal government, not for ideological reasons, but because they view it as a death sentence, a commercial death sentence to try and do business. So unless this new agency is able to buy on a more streamlined basis those cutting-edge technologies, particularly from startups, you're not going to be able to succeed.
Okay, thank you. Suzanne?
No, I totally agree that procurement is a huge part of the problem and needs to be streamlined. There are ways to do that under existing law, and we did it, for example, for continuous diagnostics and mitigation, where we have been able to speed up that process dramatically and provide to departments and agencies cutting-edge tools. But it is the exception, and certainly I think there probably are some legislative fixes that could help that.
I think it's another of the areas where Sisse needs certain authorities. I think it'll need certain authorities for hiring and keeping people as well. It may have to have a scale of salaries that is greater than the normal GS system. There could be a number of these, but certainly that's true in procurement. We're talking right now about a Sisse kind of procurement to see if it can actually take advantage of the advances in the private sector. Also, though, there will be partnerships with private sector. We really haven't talked a great deal about this, but I know my other two panelists are keenly aware of the partnership between, just say, FireEye as an example, which is one of the great attribute finders. They can always attribute fairly quickly among the best in the world with Kevin Mandia and company who it is that was the source of a particular attack. And again, they do that, I believe, much better than certainly most in the domestic arena. So certainly that will be another aspect of this. What are the authorities to work with organizations like that? If you get into DOD, as I reflect on the really important procurement advances, and I note that we have a JIADO member, we had to create organizations. This is the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Detect and Defeat Organization, because
That's beautiful.
the bureaucracy wasn't producing the solutions that we needed. If you think of the major procurement items during the time that I was privileged to command in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Mideast, MRAPs, for example, these vehicles, 2 different models, one for the Iraq, another the MATV version. Many of the drones that were brought on, the blimps with optics, towers with optics, individual kit, these were all done as workarounds rather than through the normal process. And Secretary Gates was a genius. Indeed, he loved, I think, actually to drive workarounds. But that obviously is not the way you institutionalize rapid acquisition.
I would just add that Congress, politicians are analog, and the problems are digital. And watching senior members of Congress with their flip phones, if they even have phones, deal with this is sad. And that is why we have made massive efforts to educate staff, most of whom are digital natives and can provide a big assist. And you heard in Kathleen Rice's testimony that I was summarizing that she thinks there ought to be training for members of Congress. Good luck with that. But I think we are offering the training for staff. Right here in the white, it's Jill. Hi, Jill. Welcome back. Please identify yourself and your affiliation with the Wilson Center.
Of course.
Jill.
Jill Doherty, also a global fellow with the Wilson Center. Good to see everybody on the panel. I just have a quick question, which is a little off topic, but I thought would be interesting to ask. The subject of this is digital defenses, but just this week we heard that Cyber Command went after the troll farms in St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, I don't know that much about it, whether it has been done on smaller, lower levels, but it sounded like kind of a switch in the thinking. Tell them that we're here, tell them that we know what they're doing, and go after them. So is there any, number one, do you have a comment about that just in general? Is it a different different approach? And is any of that more offensive capability applicable here in the defense? Thank you.
First of all, let me just say that I'm a huge champion of Cyber Command. I believe that it should have been elevated to the status of a fully fledged combatant command much sooner than it actually was. It finally is now the equivalent of a central command or the other geographic or functional combatant commands. Second, I'm also in favor of doing what it has done, but this has to be done very, very judiciously because needless to say, if we can do something to them, they can do something to us. That actually does have a degree of deterrence. One can only imagine that the reason that other state actors have not attacked our electrical grid, even though we know that they've conducted cyber reconnaissance within it, is because they believe that we could attribute an attack to them and we would do something in return that would be similar. So again, though, this is an area that just hasn't been developed in any way like the issues of nuclear deterrence because it's so much more complex. If you think about the nuclear age, initially it was basically two countries, then two blocks, and it evolved over decades. And the so-called wizards of Armageddon had these decades to develop their intricate theories of various types of deterrence. In this case, again, developments in cyberspace are outstripping our very ability just to comprehend them, much less develop concepts, keeping in mind that these are not limited just to the superpowers of the world. There are actually criminal entities that have them. There are minor countries. There are non-government organizations, terrorist groups. In fact, my biggest fear would be that a terrorist group that's shown a willingness to blow itself up on the battlefield, in other words, to conduct a suicide attack, would actually have the cyber equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction. And I don't know how you could deter a group like that from employing that capability if it had it. This is by no means the first time that we have actually used those capabilities. It's publicly known. I'm talking about that now. There was a joint task force established to take the fight to the Islamic State in cyberspace, as well as through the air and on the ground and so forth. And that's publicly known. And in fact, the commander of Cybercom now was the commander of that one. He was a 3-star and the head of the Army Cybercom. In that role, he was made the Joint Task Force commander. And so we were going after them in cyberspace, obviously trying to disrupt to the extent that we could, even as we were going after them kinetically to try to destroy the physical structure in which the cyber elements of the Islamic State were located. And this was, by the way, the most successful employment or exploitation of capabilities in cyberspace, use of social media and so forth by any extremist group in history. And in fact, even after we've physically destroyed the actual center in Raqqa and chased ISIS all over Iraq and Syria, there are still capabilities in cyberspace. And these are getting ever more difficult to combat because there are some now that employ, I think it's net zero it's called, which is a peer-to-peer hosting rather than actually using, you don't have to actually have a server on which to store the content anymore. You have this network of peer-to-peer that is established and also the use of the dark web, which makes this all much more diabolically difficult to disrupt, to defeat, to confront, to counter. So again, I think very important to be using some of these capabilities that we've built up with Cybercom, which of course is also partnered with NSA, which often gets the intelligence on a particular activity and then a sharing with the offensive elements that have been built as part of the establishment of Cyber Command.
I would just point out we teach this stuff in our cyber boot camp. So very smart Hill staff know about it. We're going to take two last questions. One is over there and one is over here, and we'll take them together, and then we'll wrap up.
My name is Dave Loudon. I'm a retired cryptologist and now a national security and policy analyst. So to ask the question directly, and if you're familiar with it, great, and perhaps you can expand on it. Recently, the Department of Defense announced that it was going to adjust some of its assistant secretary positions to allow it to create a IT cyber assistant secretary, which will call for Senate confirmation. And the Navy, and in the case of DOD, it's the nominee is Dana Deasy. For the Navy, they've announced their intention to do exactly the same thing by shuffling their allotment of assistant secretary of Department of the Navy's around to allow that to take place. The name, though, they've selected is CIO, not Sisse, but the intent is the same and the goal is the same. So that Senate elevation might be something that your marketing and branding might avail itself of.
Okay, last question over here. We'll take them together.
Thank you. Jeff Selden with Voice of America. General, you were just talking a little while ago about the need to use some of the cyber offensive capabilities judiciously. There's also been a lot made about the need to respond to cyber activities in the non-cyber realm. And in that sense, what did you make of the White House? Before the election, President Trump signed the executive order calling for sanctions for anybody who messed with or tried to mess with the U.S. elections. The intelligence community report that was produced as a result of the executive order concluded that Russia, China, and Iran clearly did have influence campaigns aimed at the election. The DHS and DOJ report that came out said no votes were changed, and despite all the talk about how countries that tried to interfere in some way would be hit with sanctions, there's been nothing more on that. The White House has not said if it's taken any actions. Is there a concern that the messaging needs to be stronger, and that not only perhaps does more need to be done in the cyber battlefield, in the cyber realm, but also in the diplomatic or financial realms to send messages when it comes to cybersecurity?
Okay, we'll answer these together, and your concluding remarks will be wrapped into your answers. And we will start with General Petraeus.
Well, I do think we have to take action in the cyber realm against these various activities to try to either inflame debates, magnify differences, influence voting, put a finger on the scales of elections and so forth. But it should be, as always, with a comprehensive approach to it. It can be that it's sanctions. It can be that it's various legal actions. It could be actually, again, initiatives in cyberspace. There's a number of possibilities that a creative mind could propose in that regard. But it does have to be done in a coordinated effort by the government writ large, which returns us to the question of whether or not there shouldn't be a cybersecurity coordinator at the White House and also a Homeland Security advisor at the White House with a modest office to indeed coordinate and guide all of these different activities with the authority of the president behind him or her. To the first question, I fully support the initiative to create the Cyber Assistant Secretary. Again, a lot of the organizational architecture has lagged behind developments in cyberspace. As I mentioned, it took, in my view, far too long for Cybercom, which was actually established all the way back under Secretary Gates again, and then it just didn't quite get that elevation soon enough in my mind. Beyond that, I think there are huge questions still about the roles and missions of Cyber Command. Is it, as an example, a geographic combatant command like Central Command with a geographic area that is, quote, cyberspace? Or is it a command like Special Operations Command that provides specially trained and equipped individuals to the geographic combatant commands like Special Operations Command? Or is it a service which is actually able to recruit, train, educate, equip, retain, develop cyber warriors who are then used by combatant commanders? The truth is, I think it's all three, but we haven't really yet gotten all of the big ideas, much less, again, the authorities aligned in this organizational architecture, some of which is going to take considerable thought. But in the meantime, of course, capabilities in cyberspace are rapidly developing, and we've got to be quicker in responding to them with big ideas, with legislation, with policies, with regulation, and with, indeed, organization change as well.
Suzanne.
On the question of Senate confirmed and whether there's a model there and what's happening in DoD for Sisse, I would just note that the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is Senate confirmed, as I was as the undersecretary at DHS. It's not entirely clear to me that in the organizational structure this has resulted in an elevation of that position. I mean, as the undersecretary, I was technically the number 3 person in the department. But I do think that being the head of it, the key there was to recognize that what was taking place on cybersecurity was operational. It was not, it was more like what was going on in TSA and FEMA and CBP than it was like what was going on in the undersecretary under the undersecretary for management. And so that was really important, and that I think is going to be a key part of empowering Sisse to do what it needs to do. On the sanctions with regard to influencing elections, I think, yes, we do need to carry through on what we say, we're going to do. And so I think it will be, sending a very bad signal if we don't wind up with some sanctions coming out, given what's been said publicly about influence efforts. I think it is complicated. As I say, it's complicated in part by the politics, frankly, coming out of the White House with regard to, what the government wants to say, do, or how seriously it wants to take Russian interference in elections. It is a fraught issue that I think complicates a true interagency effort and is reflected in not having a strategy yet, really, for approaching that. But it's also that no department or agency has been given the task of organizing and leading a whole of nation approach to counter influence operations, as opposed to election infrastructure, cyber attacks, malicious cyber attacks on infrastructure owned by state and local election officials, for example, which clearly falls within critical infrastructure. DHS knows it has that mission. It's been clearly given that mission, and it's off and running. There is not that same level of clarity with respect to the broader influence operation activity, which may be much more pernicious.
Evan?
And I'll start off also on the DoD procurement acquisition position, because I think that is really helpful because there is within the, as one of the earlier questioners said, government procurement, and especially DoD procurement, is complicated, fraught with peril. And right now there's been just an increased focus on cybersecurity and controlling defense information, that having an elevation, as General Petraeus said, will help sort of provide better governance, better infrastructure and oversight. And we really do need that, because the industry really is being pushed in the middle between the procurement laws, how they have to manage a global infrastructure, and actually providing their goods and services to the government. So I think having sort of clarification and having an evolution of that process will be really helpful. I'm just going to, end by saying I think really what we're in the middle of is the development of this concept of defining really what is a collective defense and response capability at the national level. And we've talked about different elements of it, whether it be things that are happening sort of in industry where companies are dealing with ransomware and malware attacks, or whether it's happening at sort of our pieces of public sector, such as our election infrastructure. Right now, we have a really sort of isolated and almost segregated approach to how we defend this infrastructure, because as we've heard, there's one set of agencies that are responsible for offense, and that's fairly unified and coordinated and thankfully very, very well managed. But when it comes to defense, sort of everyone's in charge, and some of it's government, some of it's industry, and some of it's falling between the cracks. And that's the part that really needs some better definition going forward.
So let me thank General Petraeus for suggesting the idea of this panel, which I thought was superb. thank Kathleen Rice in absentia. She had to vote, but she did, through these remarks, which I was trying to summarize, put some of the good ideas in circulation. Thank Suzanne and Evan for, as ever, being enormously competent and helpful in guiding the conversation. Thank Meg King, hiding in the corner, and her ACE staff for all that the Wilson Center is able to do in-house on this issue. And finally, thank a very enlightened audience, you folks in the room, and we know this is streaming and it gets out everywhere on our platforms, for caring enough about an issue like this, which, as we have all said, has to be in the national consciousness in order to propel the right solutions. And this idea of a cyber weapon of mass destruction is terrifying. It's also here. I mean, there can be possibly a catastrophic cyber attack, a cyber 9/11. I'm not a fear mongerer by disposition, but I am trying to stress, and we all are, the urgency of getting ourselves prepared, both in the private and public sectors for this. And I'm proud of the Wilson Center for trying to make sure that everyone's hearing about this. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for what you're doing and your support of Sisse.